Alarming gender-based violence and femicide reported cases continue to be a scourge in South Africa, with many women and girls bearing the brunt of these violent crimes. Now, recently, President Cyril Ramaphosa called for men across the country to take a stand against gender-based violence and femicide by signing a virtual pledge. He also urged all of society to work together to end gender-based violence and called on men who live by a positive values to assist other men to mend their conduct and to report instances of abuse and related wrongdoing. This morning, as we continue our focus on Women's Month, we take a look at the role that men play and are playing in the fight against gender-based violence and femicide by talking to men who are playing a positive role. We're joined right now by Bafana Khumalo, who's the co-executive director of the Sonke Gender Justice project. Bafana, thanks so much for being with us. We are also expecting Thabo Mweketsi, a social activist, to join us. He's not there at the moment, but should he be available, he will join the conversation. But Bafana, thanks to you for joining us and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sakina, and good morning to your viewers.
You know, when we talk about gender-based violence, Bafana, you know, a lot is said. There's a lot of recrimination and all sorts of other emotive expressions. But the reality is that the majority of perpetrators of gender-based violence and femicide are men. And we cannot talk about a solution to gender-based violence and femicide without talking about men and to men about these solutions. So in your sphere where you are working, Bafana, with men and boys, how are they feeling about just the general discussion in the public domain about gender-based violence and femicide?
Well, Sakina, 10 years ago, when you raised this topic with men, there was lots of defensiveness. There will also be, people who make justifications for the behavior of men. Men are abusive because they are triggered by women. Men actually are asserting their rights. Men are, pushed to act in particular ways. I think there's a shift from that kind of paradigm. We now have a lot of men who acknowledge that there's a lot of self-reflection we need to do as men. That gender-based violence is not just by accident. It is a deliberate attempt to control women's bodies. It is a psychosis that we as men need to confront the demons in our own lives around our self-understanding of manhood and masculinities. And the sooner we arrive at that level, then we are closer to getting the solutions. I must say that I'm gratified to say that I now see a lot of men who are owning up, who take responsibility for their action, men who hold other men accountable for their actions, men who do not justify or excuse the behavior of some of us when we fall on this trajectory. And I think we are seeing, for instance, a lot of men, whether in church groups, men in the unions, who have taken up this challenge and set up, male gender forums in order to have frank conversations about these issues so that we really do not try and sweep things under the carpet or try and justify things that are wrong. The president has done extremely well in leading from the front, talking about these issues openly, challenging us men to really stand up and be counted and not look the other way. And I think there's a response that is reciprocated by many men. But the challenge is still out there, Sakina. Truth be told, we still have a long way. The level of gender-based violence in this country is still extremely high. We are 5 times higher than the global average, and we still need to do a lot of work. In our own interventions as Sonke, we do work in schools, because we think we need to do a lot of work with young men. Because when we are able to inform the norms that influence behavior by young men, we have a greater future for men who can behave differently, and that we can turn the tide against gender-based violence. We need to work with men who are in prison for these kinds of episodes, so that part of their rehabilitation must focus on what is it that led them to do the acts that led them to be imprisoned, so that when they come out better persons who also are given a second chance by society, so that they can rebuild their lives, but they can also start on a fresh trajectory which responds to the need to respect and treat women with dignity. So we have a long way. We have a national strategic plan which is very comprehensive, which has covered the ground in terms of what needs to be done. The challenge at the moment, of course, is the implementation of that plan. Civil society has got shoulder to the wheel. Private sector has come to the party, set up a gender-based violence fund. We're waiting for government to really come to the party and ensure that we have a coordinated mechanism for this strategy so that it can be monitored properly and it can be implemented across the sector so that we can derive the results of what that strategy is promising in turning the tide against gender-based violence. So the jury is still out. We still have a long way to go, but I'm quite gratified, at least with the steps that are on the way in actually ensuring that we respond quite positively to the challenge of gender-based violence and femicide in our country.
Bafana, and to all the things that you've just said, you talk about working in schools, how men are taking up at least discussions about these issues in the settings in which they find themselves socially. And I'm reminded of one of the voice notes that came through this morning where one of the contributors, it was a lady who was talking about men being so angry, and especially those with absent fathers. We know what the stats are in our country in terms of women-headed households and just absent fathers in our society. You look at that, you look at some of the social ills that these young boys are exposed to at a young age, toxic masculinity in various forms. You've got the drug problems, you've got the gangsterism problems, and all sorts of things going on that obviously impact on young men. How are you finding, that particular segment of young men to work with at this point? What are some of the challenges that you can immediately recognize that perhaps we should be paying more attention to?
That's a very important point you're raising, Sakina. The Human Science Research Council does what we call household surveys, looking at the role of parents in homes and the presence. And that report is not very gratifying. I mean, that report indicates that in almost 70% of birth certificates in South Africa, there's no name of the father, which is part of the problem. We all know that we have single households in South Africa, majority of whom are headed by women. And that creates a serious gap where young people need a father figure in their lives, somebody that they can refer to when they have challenges. In this instance, both boys and girls need their fathers. We are doing work at Sonke, a program called Men Care. Part of this program is that we do a report periodically called the State of South African Fathers Report. And what we are finding out in that report, which is very interesting for us, is that much as we may have a lot of what we call absentee fathers, we also have what we call social fathers. In other words, we have people who fill in either as uncles or men in the community who make themselves available to provide support to young children for their homeworks or accompanying them to school, or coaches of the various sporting fraternities. Many of these end up filling in the gap that is opened where a young person does not have a father figure in their lives. And this contribution, this report indicates, makes also a huge impression in the lives of our young people. So much as it is important for young people to have biological parents together with them, but life is life. Life happens, and some fathers, fail to play their role. I mean, if you go to the maintenance court now, talk to any woman, many of the fathers, run away from their responsibilities, and it is a problem which I think we need to address as society. But we are suggesting in this program that we also need, as fathers who have a bit of time, who have the will to can provide support, to step in the gap, so that as we are trying to resolve these bigger societal challenges, we should at least be available. If I have a moment that I can spend with a young person who does not have a father figure in their lives, by simply offering coaching, mentoring, just some time for that young person to know if they have personal challenges where they need a father figure in their lives, they can approach me and I can have the time to spend with them. That makes a huge contribution in the lives of these young people.
And of course, critically...
Now, Sakina...
sorry, Bafana.
Sure, yeah.
No, you wanted to conclude your point? Yes?
Yeah. So the point I'm making, therefore, is that indeed we do need, a presence of fathers in the lives of children. They don't have to be biological. It is ideal if it's biological. But if life happens, the others can provide the necessary support so that indeed we can provide an experience for young people that they can have somebody that they can go to if they need a father experience in their own lives.
And of course, Bafana, unfortunately, we're out of time, but the signing of that online GBVF pledge, that was not, an event. I would imagine it's a process whereby you want to have this continued pledging by men of their support to end gender-based violence and femicide in the country. Fortunately, we don't have more time to get into that, but appreciate your time and your insights this morning. Bafana Khumalo, who's the co-executive director at Sonke Gender Justice, and he was speaking to us about the role that men can play in the fight against gender-based violence and femicide in our society.